Great. Yeah, so as Omri said, I'm a graduate student in the geography department and a political economist, and I study predominantly the LNG industry here in BC. And I'm one of the two authors of this report that was published by the David Suzuki Foundation last year. And I do want to be clear from the start here that while the report was commissioned by DSF, everything in the report DSF stands by. It's likely that I will say things during this presentation and Q&A that are not part of the report. And in that capacity, I'm speaking as an individual, as a researcher, and not on behalf of the David Suzuki Foundation. So without out of the way, as Omri said, I'll take 20, 25 minutes, then we'll do a Q&A. And I'm going to go through the impetus for the report, the methods we use, our key findings, and then I'll touch on some of the developments in global LNG markets that are raising further questions for the industry, both over the last year and, of course, also over the last couple of weeks. Um, so this project in particular, the report was spurred by an earlier research project conducted by some of my colleagues, Rosemary Collard, Jess Dempsey, and Yusuf Bouchi, who is a co-author with me on this report, published a study on the mining industry that compared the economic impacts of major mining projects with the economic promises made in their environmental assessments. At a broad level, this report attempts to do the same thing for the liquefied natural gas industry, the LNG industry, but it faced sort of an obvious methodological problem, which is that at the time this report was written, the LNG industry did not, in fact, exist in BC. And so we weren't able to conduct exactly the same analysis. But we still wanted to assess what the economic reality will look like as the industry develops, as opposed to the sort of rosy-eyed forecasts that are given by proponents. So what we did is we inventoried the promises made both by proponents and government in early stages of these projects, typically in their environmental assessment applications. Then we reviewed how real circumstances are likely undercutting, or in the case of LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink, have already visibly undercut those promises. And finally, we assessed some of the underrepresented costs that the industry is bringing to BC and Canada. So the gist of the mining report that my co-author Yusuf and colleagues Rosemary Collard and Jess Dempsey published, the findings will probably not surprise anyone, but generally what they found is that mines consistently failed to open on time. They only operated for a portion of the time that they claimed they would. They consistently employed far fewer people than they claimed they would, and they consistently failed to produce the tax revenues that they claimed they would. Those authors in that report also found that delays and failures to operate at claimed scales were by and large not driven by regulation, which is what we hear in the media and from the industry itself, and sometimes from government. But in fact, their sort of failure to open, failure to operate was driven by market and investment conditions. So in terms of specific methods, we took a number of different approaches to trying to produce similar analysis for the LNG industry. First and most fundamentally, we assessed the province's history of LNG project proposals and approvals. And then for the terminals and pipelines we considered most serious, which are the ones that we sort of understood as having made steps through the regulatory process as opposed to just being announced but never really pursued. We inventoried the claims that these proponents made about economic effects in their regulatory applications. And this is an interesting one because there's no standardization here in terms of what estimates are provided or the granularity of calculations. There's no requirements about what they submit. Um, but despite this lack of standardization, these numbers that appear in these applications are regularly and explicitly cited by regulators to justify project approvals. And they're also repeated regularly by politicians and media with no critical assessment whatsoever. So think here, for example, of the commonly repeated claim that LNG Canada is the quote, largest private sector investment in Canadian history, and also a similar claim that it's a quote, $40 billion investment. These claims come almost exclusively from unsubstantiated claims made in the environmental assessment application. And even with that in mind, it's further misleading because in the application, those cost estimates refer to a high scenario cost estimate for both phase one and two, when only phase one has actually been built. So this is just an example of some of the ways that these claims sort of make their way out of containment in these technocratic documents and into the broader media ecosystem. Um, we also found that many of the tax revenue claims made by proponents were made prior to the 2018 LNG Canada final agreement and the 2024 move away from the carbon tax and towards the new output-based pricing system. And so to estimate the impact of these changes, we use the numbers provided by proponents about revenue at different scales in their applications, again, which are numbers that have sort of no methodology behind them that is publicly available and are generally escape scrutiny. But we used those numbers at face value and then estimated the revenue that was wiped away by some of these subsequent legislative changes. We also reviewed corporate materials and some of the provincially mandated reporting to assess the reality of LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink's construction employment claims. And we reviewed and estimated a number of unaccounted for negative economic effects, particularly including the potential drag that rising utility rates will have on economic activity. So, for those of you who've read the report, you'll recognize these key findings from our executive summary. I'm going to spend the rest of my time going through each of these in a bit more detail, but there's one additional point that I want to cover, which our report did not really address, which is the question of structural risk to the LNG market and the position of Canada in a global investment glut. And I'll talk about this briefly at the end. This picture here, of course, is former Premier Christy Clark in the year 2015 at an LNG conference. So our first finding was quite similar to the mining industry study, in that we found that the LNG industry in BC had been characterized by sort of vast promises and underwhelming delivery. So in 2011, Christy Clark declared that there would be three facilities operating by 2020, that the industry would create 100,000 jobs, and that BC would generate a $100 billion prosperity fund from it. It's been 20 years now since the first project was approved, and not a, well, now LNG Canada has just ramped up to around full operation for its phase one construction. So there's now one operating project after 20 years. And this has not been for lack of government support or approvals. Every project except Sealism's was approved within a year of applying. And many of these projects were started and later abandoned by their proponents. So in the last couple of years, a few of these have become more serious. LNG Canada obviously is now approaching full operation. Cedar LNG, which is a small project that will also tie into the Coastal GasLink pipeline, is under construction. Woodfibre LNG is another small project in Squamish associated with the Eagle Mountain pipeline being built by Fortis. That's also under construction. And that's it. There's a couple more projects sort of potentially coming down the pike, but at the moment, nothing else has entered construction. And we're told now, as we've been told over and over again for the last decade, that there will be an impending LNG boom, but even this seems to be kind of questionable. Interestingly, so LNG Canada Phase 2, which represents a doubling of the existing LNG Canada facility, and the Sealism's LNG plant and the associated Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Pipeline, or PRGT pipeline, uh, both projects were bizarrely included as fast track projects by Mark Carney in his major projects office, projects of national interest, despite both of them already being fully approved at effectively all levels. And uh, just the only thing holding them back is that neither project has a final investment decision. So investors are still hemming and hawing about whether these projects move forward, even though Mark Carney's sort of attempting to smooth this and make it move forward more quickly by claiming that he's fast tracking them, despite the fact that they have no regulatory hurdles left to cross. Um, Suffice it to say, the problem for this industry has not predominantly been red tape. It's been the reality of commodity markets and investment conditions, specifically the LNG market. Um, and at a macro scale, the industry is nowhere near meeting any of the promises that anyone from Christy Clark through David Eby has made. So one of the biggest boons that proponents and a number of number of levels of government tout about the industry is its ability to bring in tax revenue. And what we know about this, or sort of the estimates about proposed tax revenue, come from the proponents' environmental assessment applications. So similarly to some of the investment numbers and some of the things I was talking about earlier, these are included in their applications but face very little scrutiny. The BC government does not critically assess these numbers when it's assessing environmental applications. Instead, they take them and they use them directly in communications justifying approvals. There's two major problems with this. So the first is made most obvious by LNG Canada. I talked already about how Christy Clark dreamed of a sovereign wealth fund, of eliminating the provincial debt, and so much more based on a windfall revenue stream from LNG. But ironically enough, LNG completely failed to move forward under her government, and the province's first LNG project only moved forward after the BC NDP dismantled the tax regime that might have contributed to those things. The LNG Canada final agreement gave at least four major subsidies to the company, exempting it from carbon tax increases, granting a major corporate income tax break, and granting a deferral on provincial sales tax. Since 2018, when that agreement was made, BC has made additional changes to the tax code that undermine the tax case even further. One of these is the switch from the carbon tax to what's called the new output-based pricing system. It remains to be seen how effective the system will be in terms of reducing emissions. I'm not trying to comment on that here, but at a basic level, whether or not it works to reduce emissions, it nearly eliminates revenue from the carbon tax. One of the things we did in this report was look at how much revenue these LNG projects estimated they would generate for the province, specifically through the carbon tax, and how much of that would be eliminated by the OBPS. And the answer is hundreds of millions of dollars, or about a third of the total estimated tax revenue from these projects. Other breaks include the federal government's offer of steel tariff exemptions to LNG Canada and wood fiber that were worth an estimated $1 billion in revenue. We don't know if the federal government will grant steel tariff exemptions to future projects, but it seems likely. So in general, summing up this research, we found that the tax revenue claims that government and proponents sort of insist these projects will bring have been overwhelmingly undermined by subsequent legislative changes and ad hoc tax breaks that have occurred since they were approved. This isn't the only problem with these tax estimates, though. They're typically based on a very problematic form of economic modeling. This isn't the main focus of our report, but these numbers, along with claims about jobs and GDP contributions, are based on input-output models that systematically overestimate these things. And the numbers that proponents submit in their environmental assessment applications based on these flawed models end up percolating out. So they're used by government to justify project approvals. They're regularly repeated by the media. And generally, I think this is something that people in the research communities, people in communications should be pushing back on and encouraging journalists to do as well, which is to take these numbers with some sort of critical eye, because there's really no scrutiny to ensure that they're being generated in sort of a methodologically robust way. The same is true, as I mentioned, for claims about employment and GDP contributions, not just tax revenues. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, LNG Canada and wood fiber were both given a giant steel tariff exemption by the federal government. That tariff exemption was for constructed steel modules that would be built in China and shipped to the facilities in Kitimat and Squamish. Um, Given the tariff rate at the time, a $1 billion value implies the steel modules may have represented $4 billion worth of expenditure. Um, at the time that this happened, the Canadian Institute for Steel Construction estimated the cost, including indirect economic effects to the Canadian steel industry, was $42 billion. But even if we take the $4 billion at face value, that represents between 50 and 76% of the direct impact LNG Canada claimed it would have on GDP during construction that has been sent offshore as a result of the Canadian government's tariff policy. That means more than half of the project's alleged GDP contribution was offshored after the project's approval. Cedar and Sealism's LNG are different because they've made their plans to offshore construction clear from the get-go in their environmental assessment applications. But this doesn't significantly change anything other than the degree to which they're overstating GDP contributions. Most of the expenditures on those projects will occur not in Canada, but in Korea at a shipyard, as will most of the labor for these projects. The other problem is that the industry overall is characterized by foreign ownership. Every single project except Tilbury LNG and Cedar LNG, both of which are relatively small, is majority owned by some combination of oil supermajors and state-owned oil companies. What this means is that profits from these projects are unlikely to be reinvested in Canada, undermining the economic development case and creating a structural drain of wealth from the Canadian economy. Studies have found that a significant plurality of profits generated by multinational oil and gas companies flow to shareholders in the United States. Exported profits over the lifetime of the project are very likely to dwarf the capital investments made in the province, creating both a structural economic dependence on this volatile commodity market and a net outflow of value from Canada. So another major problem that tends to be ignored altogether is the impact of the LNG industry on utility prices and what that means for the BC economy and the Canadian economy. Um, so the basic premise of the LNG industry is not that we need a new market for our gas. There's plenty, we can sell as much gas as we can create through open pipeline capacity to the US. That's not a constraint at this time. The case for LNG is that we can access a higher price point by shipping directly to Asia rather than piping it to the US, which means that the point of the LNG industry is to raise domestic gas prices and make upstream production more profitable by connecting it to a global market. What this means is that rising domestic gas prices means higher costs for consumers using gas to heat their homes and also for domestic industrial users. So in our report, we used a price forecast from the consulting firm Deloitte, which argued at the time that uh, the ramp up of LNG Canada would lead to an 88% year-on-year increase in domestic gas prices. Um, and so we use those numbers to estimate costs to residential users and industrial users in BC. For residential users, we found that annual costs would rise by nearly $200 just as a result of LNG Canada. And even more significantly, for industrial users, we found, so take Canfor, for example, a forestry company. They're a major user of natural gas. They use about 7 million gigajoules of gas annually in British Columbia. By our estimates, the price change that Deloitte forecast would raise their gas expenditures by $14 million a year just in the first year. And across the entire industrial sector, that would yield a cost increase of 223 million. Um, these increases will have major economic effects on the province that are entirely unaccounted for in the regulatory environment and the assessment of these applications. The forestry industry is not the only user of gas in the province, but they're a good example, particularly in light of the struggle the industry is facing to survive. Higher costs for residential users will also have an impact on aggregate demand. The more that we spend heating our homes, the less we have to spend on other things. What this means is that investments in LNG ultimately represent a transfer of economic activity from other sectors to the LNG sector rather than simply straightforward growth in economic activity. The industry is also likely to have an impact on electricity prices. At this point, it's hard to tell to what degree the industry will electrify. Um, Earlier renditions of the BC NDP government were requiring new projects to be electric, but the current EB government has weakened that regulation. So um, many of the new projects are planning to start using gas, but they are dead set on building the North Coast transmission line and connecting the Sealisms LNG facility to it if it moves forward. And it appears that ratepayers will be on the hook for at least part of this new transmission line, part of the new generation infrastructure required. And on top of that, the problem is that electric generation is more expensive. And so, based on analysis by the CCPA's Mark Lee, we found that the industry won't willingly electrify unless either they're forced to, which the BC government has backed down on, or unless costs are subsidized far below existing industrial rates to the tune of $250 million a year. So, increased demand, new infrastructure, this will raise rates for ratepayers. Potential other subsidies will do the same. Ratepayers effectively are going to end up paying the costs of LNG's use of electricity, which will in turn have some of the same effects that I talked about for gas. So in our analysis of environmental assessment applications and reviews, we found that the EAO, the Environmental Assessment Office, regularly identifies a range of costs that might offset project benefits, but it systematically avoids actually weighing these costs in any kind of quantitative terms. One of the issues that's rarely spoken about publicly, but that the EAO is well aware of, is the major impact that major projects have on regional and even provincial labor markets. The short explanation is that these projects don't create new employees out of thin air. They take them from other work, which leads, on the one hand, to a tighter labor market and wage-driven inflation, and on the other hand, to a further crowding out of non-LNG economic activity. This manifests both at a systemic level and a regional one. I can say personally as a Terrace resident, As I was trying to get a heat pump installed during LNG Canada's peak construction, every HVAC contractor in town told me that they'd lost the majority of their employees to LNG Canada. This labor market issue is particularly important to think about in the context of Carney and EB's fast track bills and their lists of major projects. The idea that Canada has the workforce to build multiple pipelines, LNG terminals, and mines all at the same time is a farce. It's absurd. Even when just one of these projects is going on, they bring in large parts of the workforce, not just from out of province, but from out of the country. The more projects proceed at once, the more likely it is the workforce will be dominated by out of country workers. And even then, they'll still run into trouble as the global glut of LNG projects is causing global labor shortages. The impact of these projects on labor markets is typically noted by the EAO, but the actual economic drag this creates is universally ignored. There are also major regional infrastructure costs to these projects, detailed in comments made by communities like Terrace. Government sometimes responds to these to requests from communities with grants for municipal governments, as they did in 2024. But this just represents another social cost unaccounted for in provincial decision making. It's effectively another subsidy. Our reports didn't go into great detail on other social and ecological harms, but we did find that while the EAO regularly notes the existence of these harms, their economic and social impacts are never applied as offsets against the supposed economic benefits these projects will bring. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, this was not a significant part of our report, but I do want to talk about it briefly. Um, I made this slide in November, so the final year-end numbers are slightly different than what I have here, but the general story remains the same. So there are very serious structural risks to the global LNG market. The top right chart here shows additions to LNG supply from projects that already have final investment decisions. What's up there represents a 60% increase in global LNG capacity that does not include coalisms. This is coming in the face of what looks like a massive structural shift in gas demand in Asia. We're constantly told that BC LNG is needed to supply demand for gas in developing countries in East Asia, but it turns out Asia is the leading edge of the actually existing energy transition. Pakistan has added so much renewable capacity in the last 2 years that it's shutting down domestic gas production and begging its LNG suppliers to stop sending LNG. China and India both saw LNG demand decline year on year in 2025, and amazingly, coal generation fell in both countries as well. China has also reached a recent agreement with Russia to build a new gas pipeline that, if it moves forward, may well eliminate Chinese LNG demand. Meanwhile, of course, China is exporting massive amounts of solar panels, batteries, and EVs, allowing developing countries in most of the world to skip fossil fuel development. The bottom right chart also shows something that's happening just in the last 3 years, which is that not only is China exporting these clean commodities, they're also investing massively in clean tech production across the global south. These investments now exceed the Marshall Plan, the US-led reconstruction of Europe, in real dollars. The China-led energy transition across the global south is throwing a major wrench in future demand for LNG. Obviously, this is also happening in the context over the last couple of weeks of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the energy crisis triggered by the illegal US and Israeli assault on Iran. And while in the short term, this is going to have all kinds of impacts on energy markets and what countries are doing to generate power and survive this challenging period, in the longer term, it has pretty clear impacts on infrastructure investment decisions that countries in the global south will be making because not only are renewables cheaper and easier to access, but you also aren't subject to the whims of fascist regimes or geopolitical instability, any of that. Um, and so I think from my perspective, it's very likely that this energy crisis, while undoubtedly going to cause a lot of pain all around the world, it will accelerate the degree to which demand destruction is happening, particularly in Asia. And that's it.
Well, thanks so much for that presentation, Nick. I really appreciated your ability to sort of lay out this devastating case against the economic promises that the LNG industry has made versus the realities that we've seen over the past decade of it unfolding. I'm sure that we'll be able to go into it at a bit more length, but I just wanted to touch on the last points that you were making about the current geopolitical situation as well as the sort of outlook for the LNG industry writ large. We've got these two very important pieces of news. One, that as a result of the war on Iran, there is an increase in oil prices, and therefore the LNG Canada project has decided to ramp up production. So that's on the one hand, but then on the other one, we see in Canada the provinces, all of them, as well as I think one territory at this point, getting together to say that they are in common agreement about the need for an east-west electricity grid, which might actually displace the use of LNG or fossil fuels in the country. So I guess given these facts, how do you reflect on your presentation and the outlook for LNG more broadly?
Yeah, well, first on LNG Canada's announcement about ramping up production to meet the energy needs in Asia in light of the crisis. I mean, LNG Canada has been ramping up since June of last year. They have, as people have probably seen in the news, they've had it's been a very bumpy road to ramp up, including some news in the Narwhal about a very serious issue with their flare stack. Um, all of that said, they have over the last couple months achieved near full capacity. So at full capacity, they ship once every 2 days, essentially. And they've been doing every 2 days, every 3 days since January, essentially. They put out 11 shipments in February, so it's a little lower than full capacity, but it's getting there. And so, when they come out and they have news reports say that they've agreed to ramp up production in order to meet growing needs, they were ramping up production to full capacity already. This is what they're doing. This is sort of the standard operation of a new LNG facility. They will be aiming for maximum capacity until they hit maximum capacity. And once they're there, they will be staying there because there's no shortage of people buying LNG. That's not what the risk to the market is at this stage, whether or not the Iran war happened. But yeah, so I think it plays well for the narrative about Canadian reliable energy being supplied to people in strife. But the reality is they've been ramping up for a number of months and they're reaching near capacity and they'll continue to ramp up till they reach it. Um, on the question of the East-West energy grid, I think there's no question that integrating Canada's energy grid would be a good thing for moving towards full renewable energy supply in Canada, and helping sort of mitigate some of the ups and downs that might come with that. Particularly, we don't talk about this often in BC, but we have a very renewable grid thanks to our large supply of hydro, but uh, a huge amount of that supply is sort of significantly threatened by climate change, by droughts, and by wildfires. And the more integrated we can get across Canada, the more resilient we'll be to some of those problems. So, certainly support any movement in that direction. Um, Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It's not really, it's like kind of two different things because the LNG industry is about turning the gas that we have in Canada into exports where they can be paid much more money for it than they get paid by users within BC. Um, and so, we could imagine a world where Canada is fully renewable domestically, and we kind of see this happening with places like Saudi Arabia investing in renewables, right? We can imagine a world where we're like a beacon of climate action. Of course, we're not, but imagine for a second a world where we're a beacon of domestic climate action. We've all got EVs, we all use public transit, we have a fully renewable grid that's integrated and smart and all of this. But we're still the fourth biggest producer of oil in the world, and we're producing more and more gas every year and shipping it out as LNG. So, I think the grid question is a good step forward. It is possible that it could mitigate some of the harms to consumers and other industries that use energy in BC, by making energy prices more stable and lower potentially. But it's sort of we could make those positive steps at the same time as making very problematic steps on the export side.
Great. So I just wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned there. I think it is important to just speak to the potentials of the rhetoric shifting from LNG focus to domestic use of gas that is fracked in northeastern BC. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that. And I'm also curious, you mentioned that I think you said there's no shortage of demand for LNG or no shortage of buyers. Do you want to qualify that or situate that in the
Yeah,
different
just
context?
just what I meant to say there is that like if you produce one more tanker than you produced last week, there will always be someone to buy it, right? And if this happens at sort of a massive scale, then prices will start to go down. But if it happens at like an LNG Canada scale, they can keep selling their gas. The more gas that gets out there, or the more LNG that gets out there, the more downward pressure there will be on prices. But we're nowhere near a situation where like you could have an LNG tanker that can't find a buyer. That just is not a scenario that's in the near future. It's just, the permanent or perennial question is, will you find a buyer that's willing to pay a price that's profitable for you? But by the time your LNG is in a tanker, that question, that ship has sailed essentially, right? You've got to sell it to whoever's going to buy it at whatever price they're going to pay you. So, we'll see how that develops going forward. But what I meant is just that LNG Canada can produce their maximum capacity, and they will be able to find buyers, certainly for the foreseeable future.
And I guess it
Um,
remains to be seen if phase two will have the same buyers that phase one does, given it's much greater.
Yeah, and part of the issue there, I mean, so many of these projects secure long-term contracts in advance, and that's actually a big part of how they get financing. So to go to the banks to get construction financing, they're expecting LNG projects to come with the majority of their production capacity signed off on these like 20-year purchase agreements. And so LNG Canada Phase 2 and Sea Lisms both seem to be struggling, Sea Lisms especially because they're publicly pursuing these agreements and they're struggling to get them, which is a sign, I think, that buyers in East Asia are not willing to sign a 20-year agreement at the prices that make these projects profitable. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe just speaking about that investment piece, I'm curious what you think the problem is with this focus on headline investment numbers, and how much of that investment ends up being returned to shareholders versus contributed to the province's economy. This has to do with what you were saying about these sort of vast overpromises by both the Clark government, but also successive NDP governments since then.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, it only matters in a rhetorical sense, but we can see how proponents of the industry use these numbers politically to justify further deregulation, further tax cuts, all of this stuff, and how government themselves use it to defend their records and to sort of push their agendas to support the industry. So, you know, we regularly hear Adrian Dix and David Eby, the a minister and premier in BC, talk about these investment numbers. They're like biggest investment in Canadian history, blah blah blah. Great for the BC economy, uh, and that's serving a purpose for them to say that. That's allowing them to get up there and be like, look, contrary to what the conservatives might say, the NDP are serious. We're good about doing economic development and we're attracting big business and things are going great. And so the fact that they're doing this with numbers that have very little tether to reality is kind of problematic. It's not like it creates a situation where if only they were using the right numbers, it would be fine. It's about the political purpose they're pursuing by using these numbers, and how they're manipulating the economic reality in order to pursue an agenda that they are trying to pursue and that the industry itself is trying to pursue, which is more expansion of LNG, more tax cuts, more subsidies. And so I think, from our perspective, the more work we can do to demystify the sort of reality here, the more we can undercut the political project that they're pursuing in support of the industry, and try to make it clearer to the public and sort of generally that this isn't an economic good bet for BC. This is an economic boondoggle for BC, and there's a lot better things we could be doing. Um, and then on your question of sort of headline investment numbers and shareholders and all this, yeah, I mean, those numbers absolutely obscure exactly what's happening. So when they talk about and this is happening at the federal level too. They talk about they aggregate the sort of like summed up headline investment numbers of all the major projects and are like, this is going to bring in this many billions of dollars of investment. But it's just misleading at sort of a whole series of levels, including, at the top level that large parts of these projects are offshored. So a large part of the so-called headline investment number is literally going to Korea or China or some other country, not to Canada. Um, which is great for Korea, China, wherever else, but it's just very misleading for our politicians to be making those claims. And then, yeah, I mean, it's worse than just, or sort of there's other issues with it beyond just being like a complete misrepresentation in that it doesn't really represent like healthy. It's not necessarily correlated with healthy economic development and the well-being of people in this province, or in the country. So even if there were $40 billion coming into Canada, who is that going to, as you were asking, right? It goes to multinational contractors like Bechtel, which is hired to build the Sealisms project and the PRGT pipeline. Who owns Bechtel? Well, mostly shareholders in the United States. And so, yes, like some of this money gets paid to workers in Canada. Some of money gets paid to workers who live outside Canada and bring it home with them. And a huge amount of this money gets paid to corporations that end up funneling the money to shareholders based in the United States. Or best case scenario, shareholders based on Bay Street, right? But that's still not to workers in BC. It's still not to our communities. It's still not benefiting us at all the ways that they claim it does.
So I guess the flip side of that is this, we're saying that the market has been inflated through this type of lack of oversight to the dealing of fact when it comes to what these projects promise. But also what we're seeing now is that these projects are starting to be built out, whether it will be accomplished at the scale that is promised or not, that remains to be seen. But I'm curious about the question of stranded assets, especially with regard to Indigenous communities, the Sealisms project coming to mind. But what is the risk of stranded assets, and is there such a thing as sunk costs and being at a point where we're too far in to extract those funds that we've already spent on the industry?
Yeah, I might start at the end there, which is just by saying, LNG Canada phase one is built. It's operating, right? So some people might dream that it be shut down and stop operating, but it is very much like a sunk cost and it's not going away. The public doesn't necessarily have to invest more money in it. It's there. Wood fiber LNG and Cedar, which are much smaller projects, are both under construction, and they are very likely to be completed at some point, probably over budget and over time. But beyond that, LNG Canada Phase 2 and Sealisms, these two projects are much bigger than Cedar and Wood fiber. LNG Canada Phase 2 represents a doubling of the first one. Sealisms is almost the same size as one phase of LNG Canada. And these two projects don't necessarily need to go forward. And the reality is that investors are also not so sure about whether these projects should go forward, which is why they're both struggling to reach final investment decisions. And so the question that matters politically right now is to what degree will the province and the federal government roll out the red carpet and pay these people to build these projects? And we know that they've already thrown out hundreds of millions of dollars in support of this. The North Coast Transmission Line itself is a $6 billion project that's supposed to support Sealisms. Um, and so, at some point, there's a margin that public support for these projects will cross that will push the private sector to be like, okay, sure, we'll build them if you pay us enough money. And so this is the question of like, is this worth it for Canada? And I think the answer is, in my perspective and based on our research, is very clearly no. But this to me is where the political decisions are to be made at this point, not so much on the projects that are already built or underway. Um, in terms of stranded assets, it's an interesting question because I think it's not as clear cut as people often want to think, in that it's very unlikely that LNG Canada will literally be unable to sell gas. within the next 25 years. Um,
Phase one.
phase one, yes, the one that's already built. That seems very unlikely. What seems plausible is that prices decline to the point that uh, were LNG Canada to have to be built again, it would not be profitable. So they'll be selling LNG tankers at a spot price or in long-term contracts that are lower than the sort of full cost of the operation amortized would be. Um, and so, it's not going to be a stranded asset in that we're going to have this like empty pipeline and this facility that doesn't do anything anymore, and we're going to have to figure out what to do with it. It's going to be a weighty asset that no longer produces anywhere near the revenue that they thought it was going to produce. But probably at least for some time, we'll still be able to generate revenue as long as there's a difference between the cost of gas production in BC and the price people are willing to pay for it on the open market. And fracked gas in BC is extremely cheap to produce, is sort of the reality one way or another. So that could change with a stronger regulatory environment that restricts water use and more strict methane regulations and all this stuff. It could become more expensive to produce gas in BC, but currently producing gas in BC is very cheap. Uh,
Could I just pause you there to ask, compared to, we're talking about Azerbaijan or Australia or even the US, is it cheap?
yeah, I mean, the thing is that producing gas just generally is cheap. The thing that's not so cheap is getting the gas from Northeast BC to the coast. But once you have the pipeline built, the reason it's not cheap is because the pipeline cost $15 billion to build. Once the pipeline's built, I'm not actually 100% sure of the final number on Coastal GasLink, but I think it was around that. Um, Once the pipeline's built, you just got to pump it through. It doesn't cost that much. So yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of gas in northern BC. The Montney Shale is one of the biggest gas deposits in the world. It hasn't been that broadly developed yet. The point of the LNG industry is to enable much more fracking. Um, and so, we'll see how that develops over time. But the sort of long answer to your question about stranded assets is that I don't think the existing LNG facilities will be stranded in sort of the most profound sense. But there are real long-term threats to their revenue stream and to their overall profitability. And that's where the question about First Nations and owner equity stakes comes into it. And Cedar LNG, Sealisms actually is not owned by the Nisga'a First Nation. The PRGT pipeline is jointly owned between the Nisga'a First Nation and Western LNG, a Texas-based company. But the terminal itself, Sealisms, is wholly owned by Western LNG, the Texas-based company. And so it's not subject to the same risks, at least at this stage, as Cedar. Cedar is 50.1% owned by the Haisla First Nation, and they took out a multi-billion dollar loan in order to finance their equity stake and the construction of the project. And that we got a bit of a window. They had an election recently, and the new chief of their council gave an interview in which she said that they don't expect to be generating any revenue beyond what they'll be paying in debt servicing costs for at least 10 years after operation begins, which makes sense. I mean, this is sort of reasonable expectation for a project like this. But the problem is that if if the market does, generally trend downwards, right? If we see significant demand destruction in Asia over the coming decade, prices will decline for the LNG spot market. They have some long-term sales contracts that will insulate them from this to some degree for 10 to 20 years. But ultimately, there's definitely a risk that First Nations with big equity stakes and debt exposure like Haisla will be facing a situation where their revenues are much lower than they need to be to cover the full debt servicing payments and the construction costs long term. And so not only, there's a risk not only that they won't be generating the revenue for their communities that they hope to be generating, but also that they may actually end up risking default if things really go south in the LNG market for them.
Well, thanks for that. That's an excellent rundown, and I just really appreciate your time and how wide your array of knowledge is. I just have one more question, which has to do with alternatives. And of course, there's the alternative of investing in renewable energy and in this infrastructure that's required in order to get there. But I'm wondering if you have in your mind other examples of jurisdictions. You mentioned, Christy Clark, alluding to the sovereign wealth fund of the Nordic countries in Europe. But if you have examples from other jurisdictions that have demanded more from their large infrastructure projects.
Yeah, I mean, the very first thing I'll say is a lot of what I've presented here and what I'm about to say talks about this industry on its own merits for British Columbia and those economic effects. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the Montney Shale is one of the biggest carbon bombs on the planet. It's the biggest carbon bomb in Canada, and the world simply can't afford to be continuing to develop new extractive infrastructure like this at this time. There's new news out over the last couple of years that global warming has accelerated over the last decade. We're rapidly racing past 1.5 and may race past 2 within another decade here. The climate situation is catastrophic. There's no other way to put it. And further developing industries like this is worsening that rather than ameliorating it. But with that said, I'll talk about the sort of economics of it. And I think despite what I said a minute ago about the Heisler example, I do think the majority ownership joint venture model is actually very productive. So I think the decision to move this forward in this particular industry, this fossil fuel industry, is a mistake for the Haisla First Nation. But I do think as far as sort of um, working as a state or a small non-state body like the Haisla First Nation with private capital to do large infrastructure projects, this joint venture model is actually a very good way of doing it that allows them to secure a lot more long-term revenue, allows them to have a lot more say over what's happening rather than just kind of like surrendering control over the situation to foreign capital, which is the modus operandi in the sort of like neoliberal state. Um, so, I do think the joint venture model that the Heisler are pursuing is a good one in many ways. And it's also a big something approaches along those lines are what has enabled China to sort of like perform a development miracle, first of all, to raise its people out of poverty in a period of time that is never heard of before. But also to develop technologically and sort of like be able to do all this, what appears on the surface to be sort of capitalist economic development while retaining control over what's happening. And so I think, that model is something that First Nations should look at. And it's also something that BC and Canada should look at doing more often. Municipalities should look at doing it. Um, it's a way, it's different from the like public-private partnership. It's actually public owned, but recruiting private capital to sort of make things happen from a technology and expertise and to some degree financing perspective. So I do think that's a viable approach for a lot of this stuff, especially if we're talking about big renewable projects as opposed to big fossil fuel projects. And then yeah, I mean, you alluded to Norway has a sovereign wealth fund, right? That is huge. It's one of the biggest pots of money in the world. And Canada could have had things like that. There was public ownership of the oil sands early on. The Canadian government was sort of instrumental in a lot of the technological development that enabled the oil sands to take off. And then we gutted it. It's all private. It's almost all owned by U.S. financiers now. And so we get very little of the revenue from that, and have very little control over it also. So yeah, I mean, I think uh, and also even just from a taxation perspective, right? Obviously, the LNG industry, there's some question about whether the industry would have moved forward at all with the tax regime that Christy Clark had. It kind of looks historically like the answer is no. Uh, but maybe if we did genuinely want it to move forward, it's possible the VC NDP went much further than they had to, and that we could be demanding more from this industry in terms of tax revenues. We certainly have a very light royalty regime for upstream gas production. We could absolutely be demanding more from producers, drillers upstream. Um, yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Nick, for the talk. I really appreciated just the wide variety of the conversation. And if folks want, they can check out Nick and Dr. Hira's editorial in the Vancouver Sun from a week or so ago on the LNG industry and its failed attempts to restore economic vitality here in the province. And Nick, I just wanted to give you another opportunity to plug any work that you've got or that you think that others might be interested from Sir.
Yeah. Most of my work, I'm a columnist for Canadian Dimension, so you can find my writing on energy issues and imperialism and geopolitics there or somewhat regularly. And I also write for other independent Canadian media outlets. I had another op-ed about LNG specifically in the National Observer maybe 2 or 3 months ago. So you can look there about how LNG is not a bridge fuel, more focused on the environmental question, climate question. Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, I'd just like to thank the Willow Grove Foundation and RAFBC for sponsoring our work. And I wanted to point people towards two upcoming SURG events. On March 19th at 5 p.m., there is going to be a talk on the war in Iran, effects on future energy policy, topical for today. And then on April 9th, there is going to be the Global Problem of Plastic Waste Forum. Exploring solution. So check those out. Go to our website or write to us and looking forward to the next. Thanks so much, Nick.
Thanks.